Brown lawns. Well, as we jump into this, I am Brian Unruh. I am the old guy at the University of Florida, at least in the turf realm. I've been with the University of Florida since January of 1996, so I'm about to embark on my 30th year. And anyway, that's me. And had a just had a great career here at the University of Florida, and looking forward to at least a few more years ahead of me. And so let's jump into the topic of the day, and that is, why is my lawn brown? And the sources of brown patches in lawns come in all shapes and forms and sizes. And we're going to talk through some of these things today. Now, these brown patches, not to be confused with brown patch, the disease caused by Rhizoctonia, they can be either biotic or abiotic, caused by abiotic or biotic stressors. And so when we throw those terms around, biotic are the living components that directly affect the plant or the landscape. And the abiotic are components, or the components are non-living. And oftentimes those are usually more of an environmental or a physical stress that then manifests itself into the plants or onto the plants. And we can attribute these brown patches to either doing too much, too little, or the wrong thing, or maybe all of the above. When we think about the art and the science of diagnosing problems, it can be really difficult to identify what is the actual culprit, because a lot of times there are all of these interacting factors that tend to come together. And kind of at the top of the list is that there are a lot of people that are potentially contributing to said problem. Some mow the grass, some fertilize the grass, others provide pest control. Oftentimes, in my experience, the homeowner or the landscape owner controls the irrigation. And not very often does one person have all the keys to this. And so there's a lot of these competing or interacting factors. That we can confound this even more with the fact that the average turnover in the landscape maintenance industry is just crazy high. I've heard the number of 25%, especially amongst the larger corporate lawn care maintenance companies. And so you got this turnover. A lot of times you lose historical perspective. And as we will see here in a bit, a lot of times the problems that are associated in the landscape they recur in the same spots end over end or year over year. Most have tried all kinds of remedies before they've reached out and contacted you. Maybe you've tried all kinds of remedies and still can't figure the problem out. And a lot of times the kitchen sink has been thrown at the problem, and so it just further confounds that. And I'll point out to a couple of little nuances where this comes into play as well. I harp on this slide here: water, light, temperature, nutrition. Water, light, temperature, nutrition. The environment that our plants grow in is very dynamic and it's very complex, and it involves the interrelationships between the soil and the climate, the topography, the other living organisms that are out there. But when we boil it all down, generally speaking, water, light, temperature are the primary drivers to the challenges that we experience in the landscape. And they're generally in that order: water, light, and temperature. And when we think about that for a perspective, water, it can be either, again, too little or too much. In my experience, I generally see most times landscapes are over irrigated when there is an irrigation system involved. Or at least portions of that landscape. In the state of Florida, we don't have a lot of oversight against irrigation contractors. And so all kinds of different people are putting sprinklers in the ground, and they don't understand even some of the basics of irrigation system design. We think about light, and we think about the light as it comes from the sun. We're oftentimes trying to grow landscape plants in some level of shade. Oftentimes, the front yard may be full sun, the backyard may be partial shade, or the opposite, or maybe the left side of the yard is shaded and the right side of the yard is full sun, but we tend to manage the whole landscape exactly the same. Temperature kicks into this. In the deep south here, it's our cooler winters that tend to create challenges. And probably in the transition zone in the north, it would be more of the hot summers that are going to negatively impact the turf grasses that are grown in those various regions. Well, when we look at this, plants don't talk, which may not be a bad thing. And so the information about a plant sample has to come from the person who is managing the turf, or at least observing the turf. And so when we have a problem and the phone rings or the customer calls or whoever it is, we've got to start asking kind of some of the right questions. And I like to kind of pictorially provide an overview of this. And so the phone rings, we answer the phone, or the client contacts us, we show up on the site. We want to start with kind of a mile-high view, and then we're going to work down to the problem. A lot of times we want to dig in and look for that proverbial needle in the haystack, but I think we have to pull back and say, okay, from a very high-level view, what is the challenges that are being there? And so we start asking questions of the client or of the customer, and each subsequent question should draw you closer to the problem. When we think about that, and then asking good questions should start to eliminate some variables in this equation. One of the, I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing, I follow a lot of on different lawn care Facebook groups online, and it's so interesting the level of the lack of knowledge that the general public has towards managing a landscape. And so you just get all these kind of weird questions coming out. And then it's more fun for me to look at the various, or it's concerning actually. It's interesting to look at even responses that people will start to post to some of these. And so ask good questions should start to eliminate variables, and then we go from there when we want to draw information out of the caller or out of the client as we're kind of engaging that person. And then we want to ask clarifying questions to get to the answers. And so do you have an irrigation system? And that's kind of a yes or a no, which I'll say not to ask these closed-ended questions. But and then we ask, well, how much irrigation was put on? And most of the time they'll say, well, that's about 15 minutes. Well, 15 minutes doesn't tell us anything. That's a time, not a volume. And in the landscape, we really need to know how much water went onto this. It's important as we're asking these questions not to plant the answer in the caller's mind, not to lead the witness, so to speak, when we think about that. And then we continue to drill down and we know centipede grass in this particular common grass across the deep south here, and we want to ask open questions to keep the dialogue moving. Rather than yes, no's, ask questions that then draw some of this information out of them as well. Don't assume that everything they tell you is going to be accurate or honest. This is especially true of when I do site visits. I make people awkwardly nervous because I don't tend to speak a lot. And a lot of times I'll have the client or the customer or the contractor, because of that awkward silence, boy, they just start, kind of letting information bubble over. And before long, you find out that, that maybe they have done something that they're not really wanting to admit to. It's very interesting when you go into like homeowner associations where they have a contractor that is responsible for aspects of but in the mind of the homeowner, the resident that's living there, they snuck down to the box store and bought a bag of Bug Be Dead or whatever it is, and they applied it when nobody was looking. And so the lawn care operators out there trying to figure out why this thing is burned, nothing in their arsenal would have done that. And then lo and behold, we've come to find out that in fact maybe the resident that lived there had done a little DIY activity on their own. And so then in this particular example, we're drilling down on this centipede and we see these purple leaves. This is interesting because this is typically it's kind of showing up in the deep south region right now. And we'll get all kinds of responses, well, this is a phosphorus deficiency, but then we ask a question, have a soil test been done? We look at the soil test, there's plenty of phosphorus in the soil, so we know that's not a phosphorus deficiency. Where is this type of injury occurring within the landscape? Is it in shaded areas? Is it in full sun areas? Is it in damp areas or is it in dry areas? And so we start to drill down on this, and we come to find out when we dig and upon closer examination, we do find these little spittle masses at the base of those colored, those purple leaf blades. We find this spittle mass, and we dig into that spittle mass, and we find a young spittle bug in there, and the spittle bug is a piercing, sucking insect. And we know from the research that the spittle bug actually injects a toxin similar to a mosquito injects a toxin into us to get our blood to flow. The spittle bug injects a toxin, and once that toxin is injected into that leaf blade, that leaf blade will die. And so consequently, we end up with a dead leaf blade. And so then the question comes in, well, do we treat these things or not? Well, it kind of depends. If we're growing grass fast enough, faster than the bug is killing the leaf blades, then maybe we can just outgrow it. If for whatever reason that grass is not growing very fast and you have a high level of incidence of these insects, a high infestation level, then you will start to kill some grass. So we talk about spots and patches. In a plant with a spot does not automatically mean it has a disease, nor does a yellow or a dead patch in the lawn mean that there is a disease. Now, when we think about disease, we tend to automatically go towards pathogen. So when we talk about this as a lawn disease, but if we kind of take the basic root of that word, it's a dis-ease. And so it's not at ease. And so we're going to look at kind of how do we define a disease. And so we want to throw a couple more terms in here. We want to talk about injury versus disorder versus disease. And so let's unpack a few of these. And so when we talk about an injury, it's generally a physical or a destructive physical occurrence to the plant. There's no pathogen, no organism that can be isolated in the laboratory. There's no insect gnawing on this thing, and there's no nematode sucking the life out of the root system. And so injuries typically are things like lightning strikes or tire tracks or car and lawn equipment exhaust or chemicals, be it pesticides, fuel, or others. And then animals, moles, armadillos. I had a golden retriever that would just pee everywhere and leave these big brown spots in my zoysia grass lawn. So when we just look at some of these are pictures that have kind of make their way around. This is obviously on a golf course. This is a flag stick, and so the lightning struck the flag stick, went down, distributed, and you see these burn marks. And so the interesting phenomena we experience in the deep south, we're seeing this fairly common. This is zoysia grass, and it's mower tire tracking. It tends to happen. We can't replicate it, which is kind of frustrating in a research sign. But it's typically where there's kind of this really acute dry conditions come in, and then that mower goes across this and causes these tire tracks. And when you get right down into it and zoom in on it, we have seriously desiccated and burned leaves simply from those mowers going back and forth across the property. More recently, it's interesting, the ride-on applicators, be it fertilizer or pesticide applicators, Of course, are very common in the northern landscape market, very much not as common in the southern landscape market, although that is changing. We're seeing, especially in smaller landscapes where they're trying to pull these ride-on applicators into these real tight spaces, that we can see some injury and some damage there. It's really important to note that naturally occurring lawn damage does not occur in straight lines. It is interesting to me, so oftentimes, and I'll get called into a site where one lawn was treated and one lawn was not. People's like, I didn't do it, I didn't do it. But it's to a straight line. And naturally occurring lawn damage, whether it's insects or a pathogen disease, they don't occur in straight lines, like never. And so when we think about that, again, here's a situation that's probably a multiple conditions going on here, and you kind of see it manifest here in the shade of the eave of the house. But yet I would venture to say, well, I know what happened here, that a product was applied to this person's lawn, but not the neighbor's lawn. And the additive effects of probably shade. This site was, typical when they run irrigation systems down these, there's a lot of overspray, typically in between houses. It's shaded, it's cooler, and irrigated. And so it's typically probably over irrigated on top of everything as well. And so again, this straight line doesn't happen. Here's another one. This one was a lawn I was called out to take a look at. And they swore up and down that they didn't do anything wrong. And I'm like, well, things don't die, and it's not a perfectly straight line. But what was happening here, most likely, was an applicator drug a hose in here, and it sprayed, or that was leaking, or maybe the applicator, granular fertilizer applicator, was stuck open, or whatever. The spinner might have not been spinning at the time, but we had a significant concentration of whatever it was along this area that caused this turf grass to be burned in this particular situation. Some years ago, I got called in to a national cemetery, and they had gone in and had a herbicide injury on the zoysia grass at this national cemetery. And so we got to looking at it, and you can see where they had sprayed in and around these. And so again, no fungal organism was involved with this, and it was simply a herbicide injury to the zoysia grass at the national cemetery. Again, these are all injuries that they're not caused by some critter gnawing on this thing. Here is a dinitroenolin herbicide injury, and so this was prodiamine had been applied to this area and caused significant root inhibition on the stolons of the turfgrass, and you can see where they were simply not pegging down at all. This was an adjacent property that had a lot of things going on. For one, had the same DNA herbicide applied to the site, but these 2-story tall townhouses were clearly shading the situation, and then it was completely over irrigated. And so the additive effects of all of these problems led to this turf being severely damaged. This actually was a neighbor of mine. I drove by his house oftentimes, and though I am based in Florida, I'm based in Northwest Florida, and we still see some level of dormancy or semi-dormancy of the lawn grasses in this region. And this lawn had been dormant brown all winter, and this gentleman took a non-selective herbicide to spray the broadleaves on what he thought was dormant centipede grass. And as the grass started to resume growth in the spring, it wasn't as dormant as he thought it was. And so there was some significant injury from an application of a non-selective herbicide, glyphosate, to semi-dormant turf. This was a site that I was called in, and it was had kind of baffled some folks, and had this really odd pattern there. And when I got in there and started looking and asking questions, and then actually they don't really show up in the picture, but there were actually weed carcasses, dead weeds, contained within this path. And so this was a backpack applicator. The applicator was walking along and just kind of not so randomly and not so haphazardly spraying, but you can see the walking pattern of where the spray was being applied. And so again, there's evidence there. I saw the dead weeds in the zones where it had been treated, and then in the areas that were not stunted and were not injured, there were living and healthy weeds being growing. And so again, no disease organism involved in this situation. Road salt injury. So in those areas of the country where salt is applied, or de-icing melt, and we see the runoff of that, then we can see it carrying and spilling over into the turf and following drainage patterns as well. And then improper fertilizer application. We see this often, or miscalibration of fertilizer equipment. And so again, sometimes the patterns are very obvious in a situation like this. You can see exactly where they went. You can see exactly where they didn't go. And then sometimes it's, in this case, the lighter color was not treated and the darker color was treated. Sometimes you'll see that kind of that inverse where might have been an over application, in which case then you have dying or injured turf grass up against some healthy. So that's kind of the injury side of things. If we kind of kick over to a disorder side of things, this is that interaction between the plant and its environment that is usually associated with imbalances of either physical or chemical requirements for turf grass or landscape growth. And so again, no pathogen, no fungal organism that can be isolated if a sample were to be sent to a lab. And though these are generally like cold and heat stress, nutritional, generally deficiencies, air pollution, excessive rainfall, or drought tend to be some of these. And so those that have grown zoysia, whether in anywhere that there is a frost, have likely seen this kind of striping, cool look that's there. For many years, I would show my graduate students a picture of this, and it happens on only on zoysia grass, Bermuda grass, and buffalo grass. This interesting appearance. And I would pose this to the graduate students in their exams. Give me some explanation as to why this type of injury, this is frost injury, and never really knew a right answer or a wrong answer, but it was always interesting to see what kind of answer a graduate student would give. My colleagues at Oklahoma State, Dr. Dennis Martin, teamed up with some really smart folks and actually figured this out. Ground level air convection produces frost damage patterns in turf grass. And so they introduced a whole bunch of physics and different things, and actually have come up and have figured out why that occurs. But again, it's zoysia grass, it's buffalo grass, and it's Bermuda grass that typically you will see that type of injury. But that, if you've never seen it, it really creates a really interesting head scratching opportunity. But we do see winter kill on a lot of our grasses. This is, of course, I'm based in the South, so I see a lot of this. And we said earlier when we started that typically cool season grasses are limited by heat stress. So in the middle of the summer, and warm season grasses are typically limited by cold temperatures. So more of the winter effect. So this is winter kill on centipede grass. Another example, and then you get this situation in here. Well, that's actually common Bermuda grass that is alive and well, even up in here above the date. This is common Bermuda grass. Why is it doing well? It's more hardy, for one, than centipede grass. And here's a situation where that is actually over a drain field from a septic tank. And so there was a lot of nitrogen that exudes from the septic system. And the centipede grass is a low input turf grass. It doesn't like to have a lot of nitrogen. And so we had compounded this problem. So we had stimulated the centipede grass more than it desired to be. And then here comes the cold weather and it killed the centipede grass. But that extra nitrogen in the system benefited the Bermuda grass that really can thrive in even high nitrogen situations. St. Augustine grass, winter kill as well. It tends to land where a lot of the frost injury, the heavier frosts tend to settle. Sometimes it's as simple as an improper functioning sprinkler head. I happened to be was on a site looking at a lawn, and I glanced across the street and I saw this, and there was a lady out in the driveway kind of scratching her head, and so we walked over there and I put a flag. I said, "Well, there's a sprinkler head right here," but I said it's not working very well. And you can see from this here that the head was plugged. It would bubble up right here, right around the head, but then irrigation wasn't hitting. So again, no disease, but have these spots. I was called in on this particular site, and I got there and knew immediately, what the issue was. Again, this is zoysia grass, and zoysia is very sensitive to drought. And essentially, short of putting catch cans out there to quantify the irrigation system uniformity, they said, well, the sprinklers are running, it's getting water. And I said, well, let's do a catch can test to determine how much water is hitting where. Because when the sprinkler system was installed, the shrubs were not as large as they were. And now the shrubbery are impeding the overlapping of the sprinkler heads. And so these areas are in fact getting dry. And it was in fact drought. We also see in turf a spring yellowing phenomenon that occurs. And this is a disorder. There's, generally speaking, no disease, no causal organism associated with this. But we see this yellow happening in the spring. And it tends to be really aggravated after that first spring fertilizer application was applied, and which causes folks to kind of scratch their head because I just fertilized and it tended to get worse. What's probably happening here is it is more aggravated in cooler, wetter springs. And so what's happening is the root function is suppressed or delayed because of the cool soil temperatures and the wet soil conditions. And so when the fertilizer was applied, areas where maybe the root system is healthier will assimilate that nitrogen that was applied, the fertilizer that was applied, and it will green up at a rate faster than maybe the area where the root system is compromised a bit or has not woke up yet from its winter nap. And so you just see this non-uniform assimilation of applied fertilizers, and it manifests itself in this yellowing that takes place. Now, here's a situation where, though the turf grass may be fine at the moment, if this continues to go unchecked, you're going to start to see some yellow or brown patches show up simply because turf grasses do not like to get their feet wet. And so when you have a situation like this where a site is holding water or underwater, then in time the turf is going to thin out and you're going to have a lot of problems. And so now, we've talked about injury, and those again are non-biotic. There isn't something living that's attacking some things. We've talked about disorders. Those tend to be more physiochemical or climate control kinds of things that are causing. And then we move into the disease, which again, we'll go back kind of the basics of that word, dis-ease. And it's any disturbance of a plant that interferes with its structure, function, or economic value. And now these can be infectious. In other words, a biotic, a living organism stresses this thing out, or non-infectious, more this physiochemical stress, which could then kick over into that disorder as well. And then we come to the disease itself that typically involves a pathogen. Pathogen is a parasite which can produce extensive damage from substances produced by itself. And that damage can be increased cellular respiration. It may be the cells collapse. It may be that the disease causes wilting to take place, or potentially an increase in cell division or cell size. And so now we're into these brown spots or brown patches that, given the right conditions, if we were to send a sample off to a lab, that they would be able to isolate some living organism that's causing this problem. And when we talk about plant disease, we want to talk about two terms, symptoms and signs. Symptoms are a change in the function and appearance of a plant caused by a disease. And so maybe it's that wilting, maybe it's the yellowing, maybe it's these lesions, it's the brown patches that start showing up in the lawn. And so those are symptoms. And then we want to look at signs, and signs are the actual microorganism themselves. So we go into the laboratory, we look underneath a microscope, and we see some of these lobed hypophodia. So these are the actual disease organism, or over here, maybe some spores that are growing in this root. And so this is the actual organism that has infested the plant. One way I like, so symptoms and signs, we think about the symptom of a mosquito bite on us is the welt or the red spot on our arm that is itchy. So that's the symptom. And then the sign of the mosquito is the actual insect itself, or maybe you even hear, that annoying buzzing in your ear. And so symptoms and signs. Symptoms, I think, are worth stepping back. That's the change in function or appearance of the plant caused by the organism. And then the sign is the actual organism itself that is causing the problem. So when we think about the art and science of diagnosing problems, many disease and insect outbreaks can be regional or seasonal in nature. Okay. And I'm going to show that a little bit. And then there is actually a study of this, and this is, we call it epidemiology. Some in the plant world will say epiphytology, but it's the study of all the factors that determine the presence or absence of disease, disorders, and outbreaks. We tend to think about epidemiology, when you think about, there's a high level of cancer incidence in a particular region. Well, why? And that the study of that why is this epidemiology. But we see it in our diseases and problems within turf. And so this is a chronology of the top 10 Bermuda grass putting green diseases. This is a list that the Plant Path folks at NC State put together. And I want to show you down here on the bottom of this. So this is every month. And so these are samples that come into the lab every month. And they just tally them up. And then you start to see, when do these problems occur? And again, there's a seasonality to this. But if we go down here to this no pathogen found, notice that it's the most prevalent. Now, there's a potential lot of reasons for that, but one of which is maybe the sample was pulled after a fungicide had been applied. And so maybe there was an effective treatment, but we wanted to go ahead and send it off to the lab. Or just because you have a disease, but maybe they find some causal organism on the plant, but it, maybe it's secondary or tertiary in this. But no pathogen found is the most common result when you send a sample into the lab. And it's an interesting dynamic. And so we go back to the question in the Northeast in late summer, it seems impossible to differentiate between heat stress and disease damage. Do you agree? And so I do agree. And it kind of, which comes first, the chicken or the egg. And when we think about certain diseases, well, let's think about our health. If our health is compromised, then it's so much easier for us to catch any little bug that comes along, right? We saw that play out in the pandemic. Those that had underlying conditions were much more impacted, by the virus. And so it is difficult to differentiate. And then which one do you address? If it's heat stress, there's only so much you can do, especially in the cool season. I mean, you can put too much water on it, and then you end up scalding some things, and then versus the disease or the actual organism that may or may not be there. Diseases are also in that study of these diseases. We said there is a seasonality in this, but there's also kind of a regional, and we get rust on turf, and it's a much bigger issue in cereals, wheat and crops like that. And we know that as the weather patterns and as wind moves, that the spores of rust move, and so these are taken from the wheat belt, but it just kind of goes to show that you can see this, and there's actually tools that model this movement of this disease, and we're developing, or there are some of, like, our plant pathologists and our entomologists are developing tools to help be able to track or predict the outbreak of these particular diseases and or insects. And so armyworm has been kind of a big deal this year, and a couple years ago we kind of had the Armywormageddon really all across the country. And so this is NC State turf bugs have a little tool, citizen science, where you go in and you can log and map where you're seeing the outbreaks. A colleague of mine at the University of Florida I'm working with, we're actually looking at the way, when you think about fall armyworm, we know they overwinter in South Florida and South Texas. And then we know that those populations then disperse up through the country. And it's been interesting to kind of track this and see how this works. And it has greater implications for resistance management. Let me unpack that just a little bit here. If we think about, if you're in South Texas or South Florida, and armyworms are pretty much a year-round problem. And let's say we use the same active ingredient constantly to try to control those armyworms in South Texas and South Florida. Well, then, so we've developed, or we selected some resistant populations in those South Florida and South Texas. And then as those insects start to migrate or move up north, and we know the Texas armyworms tend to move kind of up and across the country, up through Tennessee and into Virginia, and then the Florida ones tend to kind of go up that seaboard. We actually move resistant populations north. And so the way in which we effectively control those in the South or we should control them in the South, has profound implications for the way they're managed up north. So if we do a poor job of managing the insect in the south, in the southern regions, and resistant populations build up and then disperse north, then they're very difficult to control as they move north. And so that's this epidemiology, or the study of these things, whether it's diseases or insects. And so when we think about the large patch damage, and now we're going to throw a couple terms in here. So in warm season grasses, we call it large patch, and in cool season grasses, we call it brown patch. And that kind of differentiation is more recent. We used to just call everything brown patch and we would be good. But it's large patch on warm season grasses and it's brown patch on cool season grasses that tends to impact the disease. They're both caused by Rhizoctonia solani, but they're different strains, so to speak. Again, we kind of go back to COVID. We had the different strains of COVID. Same things kind of happening within these disease organisms, and they adapt over time. And so the group that infects warm season grasses is a different, what they call a anastomosis group, than those that impact the cool season grasses. And so we see this large patch damage here caused, again, this is by a fungal organism, Rhizoctonia. So here's an interesting one. We have a nasty little critter down here in Florida. It's a virus that is wiping out Floratem St. Augustine grass. And it's the mosaic disease of St. Augustine grass, or sugarcane mosaic virus. I think it's actually a complex of a couple viruses that are causing a problem. Of course, it's a virus, so there is no chemical control for this. And so then you show up in a lawn and you see a situation like this. You got dead grass, live grass, dead grass. Well, both of the dead areas are Floratem St. Augustine, but this middle section here had been regrassed with a different cultivar of St. Augustine grass that is not impacted, or at least impacted as much, by this sugarcane mosaic virus. So again, these are kind of head scratchers, and you show up and you've got clearly a dead area, a live area, and a dead area. Why are some of these happening? It could simply have been a switch out of a particular variety of grass that was being grown. We know, for example, take all root rot. So Gamenomyces graminis, that's a causal organism that really affects a lot of grasses. It's pretty much ubiquitous in the soil. And we know that it shows up in the same places year after year after year. And in fact, in this particular landscape, I monitored over time, and every year it seemed like they would resod the area, and then a year later they were back to the same condition of where the turf had died out. They say doing something over and over and over again, expecting different results, is a definition of insanity, or however they say that. But in this case, why not just increase this landscape bed size, change it up a little bit, and not attempt to try to get this take-all root or the St. Augustine to grow in an area. And so this is a causal organism that is in the soil. Short of excavating that soil out and putting new soil in, it's going to be a challenge. Now, again, we talked about this at the beginning, that a lot of times we have these water, light, temperature, nutrition conditions going on. So here we send a sample off to the lab. It comes back with take all root rot. So it's got that Gamenomyces. I showed you that picture of that hyphae with the lobed hypophodia. That's this disease. But here we also have some more things going on. We're growing underneath an oak tree, so we have some shade, so we have reduced light. And remember, the tree has green leaves, so it has chlorophyll in it. And then the turf grass has green leaves, which have chlorophyll. And chlorophyll is the antenna, so to speak, that grabs that light energy from the sun. Well, if you've got a big green tree over the top of your green turf, the tree is going to grab the good wavelengths for photosynthesis and deliver the inferior wavelengths that are not useful in photosynthesis. And so the grass down below doesn't get the needed light. Then we also, in this particular case, have competition going on with our root system as well. We also have, we talk about these brown patches, large patches, webworm damage. And so we have, chewing insects that come along and cause some damage. It's not uncommon. The lawn looked perfect last night, when we were sitting out on the back porch, enjoying the evening, and we woke up the next morning. We have these big dead chewed up areas. What happened? And it's tropical sod webworm damage, which can be very, very fast and take turf out in a hurry. Sometimes they look a little bit different. This was actually in my lawn. And I, from a distance, I noticed that the zoysia grass leaf blades were white, and they just from a distance kind of looked like they were like I had a dull mower blade, and dull mower blades on zoysia will produce kind of a similar, straight edges. And but I got over there and realized that those leaf blades are, in fact, they're intact. They're not chewed, but the green foliage had been scraped out of the leaf blades, and so the shape of the leaf was intact, but the green tissue had been scraped out of that. And upon closer examination, we found that lovely little tropical sod webworm that was just kind of walking over the tops of the leaf, scraping out that green growth and feeding themselves with that. Then there's some insects that just do this thing. Mole cricket damage. This is on a golf course tee. And so this one here is interesting in kind of the deep south, coastal south. We'll get things that look like this as well, and people will dig them up, and they're actually crawfish that are living in the soil that will make these earthen mounds, especially as you are in areas that have really shallow water tables. So again, there's not a pathogen involved, but clearly we are having some issues. Interestingly, in some of the warm season grasses, we're starting to see this much. When I came to Florida 29 years ago, I was taken out to old landscapes, and you would see this insect called ground pearls. And different folks at NC State and Auburn have studied these things. Back in the days when they had the really harsh chemistry, insecticide, you think about the chlordane and DDT, they were ineffective on controlling ground pearls, which is a scale insect that attaches to the roots. In its crawler stage, they're really easy to see. They're hot pink. But over the last 10 years, probably, these have really increased in problem status. And so then you can see this type of injury that tends to occur. It's almost more disease looking, but upon taking a spade and digging a hole right on that healthy versus not so healthy, when you flip that soil over, you will see these ground pearl scales attached to the roots. And then oftentimes, at certain times of year, you'll see these crawlers. And we're hearing about these problems. Dr. Dave Kopech, who was at Arizona for many years, actually did a bunch of research on these things, even in putting greens. And so they're not just to the south, but they're an interesting little critter that are essentially not controllable at the present time. There are some new, more modern insecticides, the systemics, that would probably be worth looking at as well. And then chinch bugs, an insect, not a disease, but you'll see this damage, and chinch bugs, can go from nice green, healthy, lush lawn to not so green, not so healthy, and not so lush in a real short period of time. And so in a situation like this, of course, these insects tend to inhabit hot, dry sites. And so here, we're surrounded by all this asphalt and concrete. This little island planting here was decimated by these chinch bugs. Of course, you see the adult here and the juvenile here. Very easy to detect once you get down on the hands and knees and you start to look for them. And then, not to leave our friends in the transition zone in the north, but white grubs tend to wreak a lot of havoc and cause a lot of brown patches in lawns. Interestingly, here in the deep south, they're not as problematic. I generally tell people, they're out digging around in the yard, in the garden, and they'll find a grub or two. Nothing like this picture from Dr. Potter at Kentucky. This is research grade grubs. But in the deep south, I typically say if you're not seeing varmint injury or varmint damage, armadillos or possums, in the Midwest, it was skunks. When I lived in the Midwest, that would rototill a lawn with going after their food source with these grubs. Well, as we start to bring this plane down, the curative versus preventative approaches, preventive measures are obviously treating before the pest occurs, and then curative measures treating after that pest or those symptoms are detected. When we think about curative versus preventive approaches, preventive measures for some pests, particularly those that are very destructive or very difficult to scout for or very difficult to control, preventive control is probably the most effective strategy. For a long time, kind of true diehard IPM folks did not allow for a preventive approach. You really had to address it from a curative approach. But a lot of the new chemistry in the marketplace today targets particular stages of the life cycle, and that product needs to be down before there is a problem. Or if you think about zoysia grass, for example, in the large patch organism, the Rhizoctonia. Zoysia is one of the first grasses to go dormant in the fall and one of the last grasses to green up in the spring. And if you get an infestation of rhizoc in your zoysia grass, that customer is stuck with it for a long period of time. And so those are kind of conditions of when do I treat preventively versus curative. Now, curative measures are generally employed when the pest is easily controlled or it has caused minimal damage to that site in the past. So then we kind of talk about thresholds, action thresholds. Is what trips the trigger to go ahead and decide we're going to treat. When IPM was first developed, economics kind of drove the control measure. And it was focused more on yield loss or revenue loss. And so if you were growing a crop, you would determine, here's what it costs to control it, and here's what I'm losing in yield by not treating it. And at that break-even point, that's how you would justify the control measure. Or if you were, eating an edible, fruit, apple, banana, orange, or something, and you didn't want spots or blemishes on that fruit, then that threshold was different. But in the green industry, we kind of take two additional types of thresholds, and one is injury and one is aesthetic. And injury thresholds refer to the level of damage that a plant can tolerate. And so going back to that two-line spittlebug that I showed at the very beginning, and I made the comment that when that two-line spittlebug pierces that leaf blade is dead. Now, if you're growing grass fast enough that it will outgrow that damage, then there's probably not a need to treat. But if you start tipping the scale where you're killing more leaf blades than the plant is being able to regenerate, then we've hit that injury threshold as well. But by and large, our bigger driver is that aesthetic threshold, and that refers to the level of acceptable quality decline. And so aesthetic thresholds are much more subjective. So what looks good enough at one customer might not be acceptable at another. And that's just, you have to measure that and determine what is accepted and what is not. And again, it is very subjective. This is an interesting slide that FMC uses, and I think it shows a little bit of this. But if we have the ability to diagnose over here on the y-axis, if it's easy to diagnose, you think about things like brown patch, large patch, dollar spot, rust. You see it, gray leaf spot. It's a spot, and it's on the leaf. Those are really easy to identify. Things that aren't quite so easy to identify, some of these, pink snow mold, some of these others are easy to diagnose. And then you have this ability to recover. And we think about dollar spot and large patch, unless it's on zoysia grass, you can grow out of that pretty quick if the conditions are such. Versus over here, some things that are much slower to recover from. So all of this kind of dictates where does all of this play. And there was a question here: spring dead spot, what causes it? There's a couple different organisms, but why is it so difficult to recover from? Because it just hammers that plant, and so it's difficult to diagnose up here, and it is slow to recover, and that is why it makes it so dang difficult to get a handle on it as well. And there's been a ton of work, even in the genetics of the turfgrass. And so if you look at, say, for example, Oklahoma State's Bermuda grass breeding program, one of their big focus is cold tolerance, but also spring dead spot as well. And then we look at factors that kind of influence recovery. So we think about turfgrass species. The growth rate of the grass is going to dictate recovery. If you have a very slow growing grass, then it takes time to recover. Rhizomatous grasses with intact rhizome systems. So you think about Bermuda grass and zoysia grass, for example, and you've got all that below ground stored energy. They're going to recover a lot quicker than your clump grasses or your stoloniferous grasses. And then the extent of the existing ground cover. I mean, was the brown bat, did it decimate the area? Is there any level of green still in this? How widespread is that damage? How uniform is that damage? All are going to play into this as well. And then as we wrap up this last slide here, again, these sources of brown patches in the lawns, they come in all shapes, forms, sizes. We've looked at a lot. Very few of them were actually biotic or living stresses that are caused by some fungal organism. Again, biotic living components, abiotic, non-living. And then water, light, temperature are primary drivers. And so when we kind of pull that up a little bit and filter through these challenges, focus on the water, light, temperature function first, and then start to parse out where are our other challenges as well.
Appreciate everyone joining us on this FMC October installment for First Friday. Thank you to Dr. Unruh. Thank you to Ed. And hopefully everyone has a great and safe rest of their weekend. Thanks all.
Yeah, thank you.